Hey guys, I'm Lacey Stevens with Fit by 50 Plus with a follow-up to my Peloton ride. Now, at the end of my ride, through my very heavy breathing, I mentioned heart rate zone. I also mentioned calculating calories in each heart rate zone, as well as looking at the fuel sources, the mixture of the fuel sources that got me through each of the zones. So now that I've dried off, let's take a look. All right, guys, now it's time to find out what you need to know about heart rate zones. So if you're new to cardio, the first question that you might have is, what are heart rate zones? So that's where we'll start. Heart rate zones really are a set of ranges that your heart normally beats in 1 minute. Now, there are 5 zones basically accepted. Sometimes you'll see zone 0, which is you at rest, but for the most part, you'll see zones 1 through 5. 1 being the low intensity, and then the intensity increases as the number gets higher. Your heart rate zones are going to be where you fall into the heart rate zone will be individual. It will be based on your maximum number of heartbeats in a minute. And then we'll take that and do some different calculations. But as your heart increases, as your heart rate increases and decreases while you're working out, you move up and down through the different zones. And as you move through those zones, your heart and body start to respond in a slightly different way. So in zone 1, which is about 50 to 60% of your maximum heart rate, it's really light. You could do this for hours. You can hold a conversation, just for hours on end. But what's happening in zone 1 is blood flow is really being encouraged, and that is the key to maintaining a healthy heart. So it's definitely a good start. Some activities that you might think of in zone 1 include walking, just a leisurely stroll, riding a bike, maybe kayaking, paddling. Just think of zone 1 as a really leisurely pace. Now, zone 2, when you start to step up in intensity, you've got a couple of different things that are going to start to happen. Of course, that increased blood flow is going to warm your muscles. You're at 60 to 70% of your maximum capacity, your maximum heart rate. The activity is light, and you could probably perform it for hours. But once you have been in zone 2 for a long time, or you're deep into zone 2, you might start to sweat. So you definitely know that you're doing a little bit more work. The activities there are pretty much the same. Instead of just a leisurely stroll, it would be a walk, maybe with more purpose. My mom is 70 years old, and she walks 3 times a week, and a half each time in 30 minutes. So in order for her to reach that goal, she's got to go at a pretty decent pace. Same for biking. It's not just the leisurely, almost not moving, but it's just nowhere near a sprint. The paddling, maybe you've got more weight, you've got to get to a certain place in a certain amount of time. So you've got to, even though it's laid back, you still have to be a little bit more purposeful. Same with the swim. Then you move on to zone 3, where the activity has definitely increased. It's moderate. You might be able to stay there, about an hour. But at this point, you're becoming breathless, especially the longer that you are in zone 3. You might have lactic acid start to build up in this particular zone. But from a heart perspective, your blood vessels start to expand, and which strengthens your heart and increases your ability to exercise. At this point in zone 3, now we're starting to jog, or if you're anything like I am, it's going to be a little bit more of a trot. But riding a bike, you're going further, you're going faster. Whitewater rafting, where you've got to do some work in whitewater rafting, to make sure that you're navigating correctly. So you can definitely start to get a feel for how the blood has started to pump, how you started to move more. Maybe you're swimming for distance. Those would definitely be considered activities that you might experience in zone 3. In zone 4, now this is where the rubber meets the road. Your heart is beating at 80 to 90% of its maximum capacity. It's really difficult to say, to string a sentence together at this point. I believe in the when I was doing my bike ride, towards the end, I would talk and there would be 3 or 4 words that would come out at a time. So I was probably in zone 4 at that time. And in zone 4, your heart beats faster, and it's just continuing to supply that your body and your muscles with that oxygen-rich blood that it needs. And in zone 4, that lactic acid's probably going to build up pretty quickly too. Some activities in zone 4, we're talking about distance, going a distance at a very good pace. So when you think of races, marathons, Zumba, high intensity interval training definitely would qualify for zone 4 activities. And in this particular picture, I believe, is from a triathlon. So, just imagine having to swim X distance in a short amount of time. You wouldn't necessarily be able to go at 100%, but you've got to go at a really good, steady, sustained pace. And so that's definitely a zone 4 activity as well. Now, zone 5, this is just all out effort. Your heart is beating at 90+% of its max. So just completely high intensity. Your breathing has to be very precise. It's got to be intentional almost, and all of your energy is focused on whatever activity it is that you're doing. Your blood is pumping like 25 to 50 times faster than it would if you were just at rest. I mean, it's your heart is really doing some serious work. So when you think zone 5, think sprint, all out effort, relatively short distance, but you can't sustain that. You can go all out for a short distance, for a short amount of, I shouldn't say short distance, for a short amount of time. And then your body, because you've given it everything that you've got, your body just can't go anymore. That would definitely be zone 5 activities. So now that we've looked at the different zones, heart rate zones, and how your body begins to progress and react in those zones, leads to the next question, which is, how do I find my heart rate zone? I said the zones themselves are relatively standard, but where you fall in the zones, I'll definitely help you to get that calculated. So the first thing you do is going to be to find your resting heart rate. Now, your resting heart rate, really, it's best to get your resting heart rate first thing in the morning before you ever get out of bed. Put them there on your wrist. You find that pulse, and you just count the number of times that your heart beats in 60 seconds, or that you feel that pulse in 60 seconds, or you can do that for 30 seconds and multiply it by 2. Now, 60 to 100 beats per minute would be normal for most people, but the lower the better. If you watched my intro video, you recall I said that my resting heart rate was in the mid-90s a few years ago. Mid-90s is down about 30 beats per minute at this point. There are studies that show that a high resting heart rate is linked to lack of physical activity. It's linked to high blood pressure and higher body weights too. And if you recall from my intro video, at that same time when my resting heart rate was in the mid-90s, I was actually at my heaviest weight. And that included having given birth twice. So I weighed even more than I weighed either time that I was pregnant. Now, the most precise way to find your heart rate zone is going to be really, it's called a VO2 max test. And it goes in, the purpose of that test is to find the maximum velocity, basically, of the air going in and out during a certain activity. So just imagine maybe you're on a treadmill or a stationary bike and you've got a mask on and oxygen is pumping through. A couple of other ways that you'd be able to find your maximum heart rate that wouldn't be as involved or costly. One way is called a 1 mile. It's just a 1 mile walk test, and you go out, measure, and you take some readings. You walk for a mile, you take some readings. Another way is a 3-minute step test, and it involves a step, and you're up and down for those 3 minutes, and then you take some readings there. And the quickest way to get an estimate of what your maximum heart rate would be is just a formula. It's 220, and then you subtract your age. So I will use myself as an example. I'm 49 years old, so 220 minus 49 is 171 beats per minute. And that's what I would use as my maximum heart rate. And then we'll go in and take calculations based on 171 beats per minute. This is me, by the way. This picture of me. So 171 beats per minute. 50 to 60% of that 171 beats per minute would be 86 to 103 beats per minute. 60 to 70%, it would be 103 to 120. 70 to 80% is 120 to 137. 80 to 90% is 137 to 154. And then 90+% of my maximum heart rate, which is 171 beats per minute, would be 154 beats per minute. And these zones are really the most prevalent heart rate zones or ranges, but zones themselves really can vary based on, a manufacturer or, a product. And we will actually get an example of that a little bit later. There are also charts like this one by the American Heart Association to help you estimate your maximum heart rate. Just looking at these figures, and these are just average figures, so just use them as a general guide. And also, it is very important to note that some drugs and medications affect heart rates. So you might have a lower maximum heart rate and target heart rate zone. So if you have a heart condition, be sure, or if you take medication, be sure to check with your doctor or your healthcare provider to find out exactly what your heart rate should be. And then you can go from there. But according to this chart, let me see, I'm 49, it's not here. So we'll use 50. I'll be 50 here in just a few months. So 50 looks like 85 to 145 beats per minute would be my target heart rate zone, which would be 50 to 85% of the maximum that I would be able, my maximum heartbeats in 1 minute. And the average maximum rate would be 170 beats per minute. So, just judging by this chart, you see that I'm right there where I need to be. I wasn't a few years ago, but I'm right where I need to be right now. Just looking at the information from the American Heart Association, it was 85 to 145 beats per minute, which would be my target, 50 to 85% of my maximum heart rate. So 50% looks like I'm at 86 beats per minute. And going up to 85% looks like I'd be right there in the middle. It would be about 145 beats per minute, which would be 85% of my maximum heart rate. Now, 50% to 70%, the American Heart Association labels that as moderate exercise. So when you calculate when you've got your maximum heart rate, and then you figure the different zones at 50 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, which for me is 86 to 120 beats per minute, that's considered a moderate activity or moderate exercise. When I'm at 70 to 85% of my maximum heart rate, which would be 120 to about 145 beats per minute, they consider that as vigorous activity. And the reason that I wanted to point that out is because the American Heart Association recommends a combination of 150 minutes per week of moderate activity or 75 minutes per week of vigorous activity, or a combination of the two. And that's why it's important, when you know what your zones are or what the targets are, it's easier to quantify the type of exercise that you're doing. 150 minutes of moderate per week or 75 minutes of vigorous per week is what the American Heart Association recommends. Now that you have an understanding of what heart rate zones are, and you can calculate your maximum heart rate and actually get your heart rate divided into the different zones, you might have a question. You want to know, why is this so important? Well, it's important because, first of all, it's a target. Heart rate zones are a target, and it lets you know if you're on track. Especially when you're working out, when you're moving around, doing physical activity, you know if you're on track and where your heart needs to be. Also, your heart rate zones, they're also used as indicators. A few years ago, I was doing step aerobics. And step aerobics, you've got this little step. It's not terribly high, but there was this one part that every time I got to that part, I just couldn't go on. I couldn't work my way all the way through that without having to stop. I become so winded and tired, and I'm the kind, I'm going to continue to do this until I get it. I've got to be able to push through. Well, I was doing the aerobics, and I looked down. I happened to look down at my watch, and my heart was beating at 202 beats per minute. 202 beats per minute. Trying not to panic, I just gradually slowed my heart rate down. I didn't just stop altogether. I just went ahead and stepped back, and I told myself, don't do this particular workout again in this condition by yourself. Just don't do it. This 202, it just shouldn't have been. But when you know what those numbers are, when you know those target zones, it also helps you to confirm that, it helps you to know that something's wrong, because it acts as an indicator. At that point, I knew that there was either something wrong with my watch or there was something wrong with my body. And either way, like I said, I just stepped down and I said, this can't be. So I'll have to take a different route next time. But definitely, if your heart rate is too high, you might be straining, and it's definitely an indicator of what's going on internally. And then something that we'll get to in just a few minutes too, knowing this information, the target heart rate zones and the number of beats per minute, is definitely going to help you to estimate calorie burn and fuel source mixtures during a workout. So that's another plus. So speaking of calorie burns and calculating fuel mixtures, now we'll get to the ride, my Peloton ride, the metrics from that particular ride. And it looks like on that ride, 7.67 miles, not too bad. 296 calories is what I burned that particular day. 296, there we go. So here's just a screenshot of my screen. So here's the information. So in zone 1, I was there for 7% of the ride. Zone 2, zone 3, you see zone 3 was a huge amount, almost 18 minutes of the ride. And then zone 4 was almost 8 minutes. So that's pretty decent. And you see there was no zone 5. One thing that I would like to point out as well is that here, my zone 5 starts at 171 beats per minute. Whereas when we went in and did the calculations just a few minutes ago, my zone 5 was at 154 beats per minute. Well, that was using, the calculation that I used was the 50 to 60% and 60 to 70, 70 to 80, and on. The 154 beats per minute was the zone 5, the beginning of my zone 5, at 90% of my maximum heart rate. Well, Peloton uses a slightly different metric. I had 171 was listed as my maximum heart rate based on my age. But a few months ago, I was doing a workout. It was a high intensity interval training workout. And I looked down and I saw 179 beats per minute. So I figured, if it's beating at 179 beats per minute, maybe I didn't see the 180, but I know that I can comfortably go to 180. So I actually I adjusted my maximum heart rate, because they've got a feature in the bike that'll let you do it. I adjusted that to 180. So now the zones are based on 180 as my maximum heart rate. But instead of the 50 to 60 and 60 to 70, Peloton starts out with 55% of your maximum heart rate. So their zones are 55 to 65, 65 to 75, 75 to 85, 85 to 95, and then zone 5 being 95% of your maximum heart rate. So that's why the 171 is the beginning of my zone 5 ride, zone 5 here for this particular ride. So what we will do is let's take a look at just calculating the number of calories that were burned in each zone. So there were 296 calories burned altogether. 7% of the time that I did this particular ride, I was in zone 1. So I burned 20 calories, 20.7 calories in zone 1. Same for zone 2 because I was there the same amount of time. Zone 3, which was the biggest portion of my ride, I spent a lot of time there. So it was 60% of my ride, and that is a total of 177.6 calories. Zone 4, not there as long, but the 296 times the 26% of the time that I was there gives us the 77 calories for a total of 296. Now, here's something that I think is interesting. It's not precise and it varies, but this is something else that I like to do when I have information on the different heart rate zones. Now, this particular chart, don't get intimidated. I know it really looks complicated, but I'm only showing you this so that you can see what happens, how your body is burning fuel as you continue to move up through the different zones when you work out. So you start out, this blue line here, you start out, the blue line is carbs, because our body burns carbs and it burns fat. Well, the red line going from top to bottom, left to right, is the fat. So when you're starting out at rest, you're really not burning much carbs, which is represented by the blue line. And it's almost 100% of the fuel that your body needs to eat, to breathe, to think, to read a book is coming from fat. Now, it's a really low, slow burn, but it's coming from your fat. And as you move through the zones and through your intensities, your exercise intensities or your heart rate zones, you see that the fat goes down and the carbs continues to go up until you get to what's called the crossover point. That's the crossover concept. And at that point, it's about a 50-50 mixture. So starting out at rest, you're burning almost 100% fat and just about no carbs. But as you start to move around and you exercise, the amount of fat that you're burning goes down. The amount of carbs that you're burning increases. So when you get to about, 50-50 is about 70%, which is about the beginning of a zone 3. Looks like you're burning 50% fat and 50% carbs. But do you see what happens after you reach that point? The amount of carbs that you're burning, because you continue to inch on just a little more, the amount of carbs that you're burning goes up to almost 100%, and then the fat goes to just about 0. So it's just an interesting dynamic, just understanding how your body burns the fuel, especially throughout the different zones, throughout the different heart rate zones. So we're just going to go back to the chart with all of the zones. And at the very bottom of each one of the levels, it shows the calorie fuel source. And this is what I estimate. This is what, some of the publications will estimate a fuel source mixture in each of the 5 zones. So zone 1 is 70% fat and about 30% carbs. Zone 2, the fat decreases, the carbs increases, about a 60-40 mix. And then zone 3, it's even, just 50-50. You move on past that, now it's 70% carbs, 30% fat. And then once you get to zone 5, it's up to 100% carbs, which is basically what this beautiful picture here shows us. Now, this information, really the total number of, or the fuel source mixture is going to depend on lots of different factors. So it will definitely depend on, let me get back to where I am. Okay, it's definitely going to depend on maybe your training level, food consumption, your workout duration. So there are lots of factors. So don't take these numbers that I've assigned as gospel, but I like to assign these numbers just to get an idea of the fuel sources that are being burned as you move throughout the zones. So zone 1, it was 70% fat, 30% carbs, and so that's represented by the 14.5 and the 6.2 in zone 1. Zone 2, there's a little less fat, a little more carbs being burned, and then by the time you get to zone 3, it's about a 50-50 mix. So of the 177.6 calories that I burned during that Peloton ride, about 88, 89 of those calories came from fat, and about the same amount came from carbs. Well, once I crossed over that crossover point, now the fat continues to go down. The amount of fat goes down because now we're at about 30% fat and 70% carb burn. So it definitely flips. Had I gone to zone 5, then however much time I spent in that zone, it would have pretty much been all carbs being burned. And you see the total amount of fat and carbs burned. The 138.8 plus the 157.2 equals 296 calories. So it's just a fun way to kind of go in and estimate the fuel sources for the calories that are being burned while you're working out. Now that you know all of this information, you've got to do one thing. You've got to track your heart rate. That's the only way to know which zone you're in. Or is this moderate? Is this vigorous? It's the only way that you're going to be able to get a firm grasp on that information. There are several ways to do that. One way is using a wrist tracker. I used to use Fitbit. Now I've got an Apple Watch, but just something that you will be able to, you've got it all the time and it's tracking you so that you know, if you're at rest, if you're doing vigorous exercise, it's going to give you that feedback so that you know exactly where your heart rate stands. Those metrics are really important. You can also use a heart rate monitor. When I was on the Peloton ride, there's a strap that goes around you, and it just goes in and takes your pulse throughout the ride, and it feeds the information back to the bike. And so that's definitely one way to get it done. Or you can just always do it by hand. Again, you take your pulse inside your wrist on the thumb side, use the 2 tips of your fingers, just press lightly on that artery and you just count the number of times that your heart beats in 1 minute, or you count the number of times that you feel that pulse in 30 seconds, and then you multiply that by 2. So it is going to, and you can do that first thing in the morning. You can do that before you start exercising. You can take a break while you're exercising. And, even when you cool down, you can go in and get that same information and just take the information by hand. All of this information is meant for one thing. You've got to know your numbers. When you know your numbers, you know what's going on. You know what, if anything, needs to be changed. And it also helps you set goals that you're, trying to reach. I was at mid-90s on my heart rate a few years ago. Now I'm in the mid-60s, which even though, it says that 60 to 100 is a normal resting heart rate, for me, it was alarming because of my history, my health history. And I knew that I needed to do something about it. So now I know, and I can quantify, I can say that it's down 30 beats per minute because I know what it was then and I know what it is now, as opposed to saying, well, I don't think it beats as fast, or I think I may have been in this zone or that zone. This way you take out all of the guesswork and you know for sure. That's part of being informed. It's part of being intentional, and that's exactly what I want. So I really do thank you all for indulging me and just learning what you can about knowing your heart rate zones. And because, again, I want you to be informed about issues that deal with your wellness. I want you to be intentional about the strategies that you set out to so that you can live your best life. And most of all, I want you to be in good health. Thank you so much.